Hey, thank you. This is on. I feel like Britney Spears. And they tell me I have to stay on the mat. I don't know if I'm better when I'm moving. All right, so I'm not Jane Landers. Okay, so the deal here is Jane and I are going to sort of pair up on this. I think both of us for the following ones will be physically present at the same time. Jane is on a tough assignment today. She's at a conference in Barbados. So I always say to my colleagues in U.S. history, it's like, choose your subject wisely. So here's our sort of plan. We got 6 sessions here. So I'm going to talk very briefly about slavery in the Old World and mainly about the Atlantic slave trade. So this is going to be sort of how all these people show up in the Americas, what brings them here. Then Jane, next time, will talk about slavery in Spanish America. And then the following session, I'll talk about Portuguese America, which after all is much more important, because Brazil is the most important country in Latin America, even if they named an Argentine the Pope. And I always thought God was a Brazilian. I don't know, how did this happen? So then Jane's going to come back and she'll talk about slavery in British America, and then we'll look at sort of Saint-Domingue, what now is Haiti, and the Haitian Revolution in the late 18th century. And then in the last session, we'll come back and sort of say, okay, what do we learn from all this? All right, so that's the big picture. And I always say that it's always good to be back here, and this is true. It's true. Each time you guys look younger every time I come back. It's true. All right, so here you go, Sam. Peculiar institutions. There's this famous book in American history about the peculiar institutions. So my main point is there's nothing peculiar about this. As we're going to see, slavery exists almost everywhere. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about where people come from Africa, and in fact there is no such thing as Africans. There you go, Bill. And then where people end up. So this is sort of the setup for bringing all these people across the Atlantic. And then the next few sessions, okay, what happens once they're on this side of the Atlantic? All right, so this is the picture on the top right there is actually a picture from Greece of slaves at work. The one on the other side is Muslims enslaving Christians. And the one at the bottom is negotiating in Turkey to recover Christian slaves from the Turkish Empire. Slavery has existed, it still exists, in almost all historical time periods and everywhere on the planet. So what we're talking about over the next 6 weeks is the modern transatlantic slave trade in the Americas. Jane actually, I think, at the end of that little description for the Osher book, but this is not a course about antebellum America, which is one of her sort of pet peeves, because when people start talking about African America and slavery, they all think Gone with the Wind, right? And this is this few brief decades before the American Civil War, and as I'll show you here in a second, U.S. slavery for most of its history is small compared to what goes on in the rest of the Americas. It's only in that brief period before the Civil War that slavery in the Americas is the single largest slave system. So slavery exists all over the place. What's different about slavery is everybody has different notions of what it means to be a slave, what are slave regimes, what is legality, is this person property, are they not property, what does it mean if you say they're property. So in that sense, slavery is very different across the globe and across time periods. So the kind of slavery that exists in the Americas, even within the Americas, you see, this is one of the things Jane's built her career on, differences in the way in which slave systems work in a place like British North America versus a place like Brazil. But by and large, what you see is that slavery exists almost in all societies. And before the modern Atlantic slave trade starts, there are already slave networks shipping people out of the continent of Africa. And so what this map really shows you is in the medieval period, how there are already these networks, and these mirror the commercial networks that basically what today is sort of Saharan Africa and East Africa are already plugged into complex trading networks in the Indian Ocean and in the Mediterranean world. And it's not just slaves that are moving there, it's the gold that comes into Europe before the discovery of the Americas is largely coming out of West Africa across the Sahara. So these places in East Africa, long before the Europeans showed up, are already deeply connected across the Indian Ocean to places like India, Southeast Asia, and China. And northern Africa is already connected for centuries into the European world. But if you look, this is really big picture. If you look around the world and say 1490, all right, before Columbus, you would not guess at that point that it's the Europeans that are going to expand out and conquer the rest of the globe and dominate it for the next 500 years. What we're seeing end in our lifetime. So if you look around the world, there's this powerful China over there that's been organized and sophisticated for centuries, right? In what today is India, there's already a powerful series of empires emerging. There are a variety of empires across Africa, some which have risen and fallen already. In the Americas, you have this powerful Inca empire that's reaching its peak about the time the Spanish show up in the early 16th century. The Aztec empires emerged in the 15th century. So if you look around the world, there are plenty of imperial powers, lots of powerful polities that exist. So if you were sort of place a bet in 1490 which one of these is going to expand out and dominate the rest of the globe, it would not have been clear it was going to be the Europeans. And I always joke, and it's only half a joke really, that the only reason Europe is a continent is because they named them all. I mean, look at it. It's just a peninsula that juts out from Asia. Right? So some guys sit around in Europe, they draw these maps, here's the known world, okay, we'll call this Asia, this is Africa, right? It's not even a continent. So when you look at the world in roughly 1490 and you're replacing bets, you wouldn't necessarily say it's going to be the Europeans. But what happens between about 1450 and about 1600 is it is the Europeans that expand across the entire globe. And it's led by the Portuguese and the Spanish first. Right? And this is what Columbus is. When he comes across the Atlantic, Columbus is really the sort of beginning of the sustained interaction across the Atlantic world. There are people that show up in the Americas long before Columbus. The Vikings are here. There are probably people come from Asia. There is no sustained back and forth. The reason Columbus is important, he initiates what is an irreversible and ongoing process of contact between the old world, Asia, Africa, Europe, which had long been connected and interacted, and the Americas, which had been completely isolated for thousands of years from the rest of the world. Right? So it's the Portuguese and the Spanish who lead this process. So in the 16th century, they construct the two first world global empires. Right? And it's actually the Portuguese are more sweeping even than the Spanish. The Spanish will primarily be concentrated in what today we think of as Spanish-speaking Latin America, right? Mexico, Central America, islands of the Caribbean, the west coast of the Andes region. That's where their empire is really focused. But they will also gain control of the Philippines in the 16th century. So they do actually have a global empire. But most of what matters in their empire is in the Americas. The Portuguese are traders. They're not interested in colonizing. They want to trade with everybody. So what the Portuguese construct is a global trade system. By the middle of the 16th century, the Portuguese are on the coast of Brazil. They're in southern Africa, they're in East Africa, they're on the coast, both coasts of India, in what today is Sri Lanka. They're in the East Indies, right? Basically, we're across the bay, across the straits from Singapore, and they've moved onto the coast of East Asia. They've established settlements on the south coast of Japan and across from what today is Hong Kong and Macau. The Portuguese have a truly global trading empire by 1550. The great exception to this, as we'll see 2 weeks from now when we look at Brazil, is Brazil. Right? They do settle in Brazil and they do colonize, but that is the great exception for the Portuguese in this global trading empire. But as you start to construct these empires, especially in the Americas, the Spanish and the Portuguese come across native peoples. In central Mexico, Central America, and what today is Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, there are highly organized, dense populations of indigenous peoples. There may be as many as 100 million people in the Americas when Columbus shows up. The sort of guesstimates for the world in roughly 1492 is probably about 100 million people in the Americas, about 100 million in Africa, about 100 million in what today is Europe, and about 300 million in Asia. Imagine that. Asia is the size of the United States population today. So that's the sort of distribution of the population. When the Spanish come into central Mexico and the Andes, they conquer these people. They die in droves, mainly from disease, smallpox, influenza, typhus, influenza, bubonic plague, go down the list. Maybe 90% of the population of the Americas is dead within 50 years. That's the great demographic catastrophe. They're brutal, they are killing people, but what kills people off is disease. Yellow fever, malaria, which come across on the slave ships. Right? This is going to devastate those populations. But in places like Central Mexico, Central America, and the Andes, enough of those people survive that the Spanish then construct tribute labor systems. They're not slaves. Right? They don't own them, they're not property, but it's forced labor. So forced indigenous labor systems are the pattern in the mainland of the Spanish Empire. In the Caribbean Basin and in eastern South America, what today is Brazil, the Indian populations either die off or they flee into the interior, in the case of Brazil. There may have been as many as 4 or 5 million people in what today is Brazil. We have no idea. There's no way to know. Right? We do know that the islands of the Caribbean were densely, densely populated. And by 1550, most of those people are dead. Right? So the transatlantic slave trade is driven by demand for labor. Right? The slave trade actually begins in the first documented shipment of slaves from sub-Saharan Africa, right, by the Europeans is in the 1440s from the coast of West Africa up to Portugal. We actually have a couple of incredible descriptions of as these guys get off the boats, and they're of all colors. Right? So what the Portuguese will employ, and to a lesser extent the Spanish, is bringing in sub-Saharan African slaves for about 40 or 50 years onto the Iberian Peninsula, mainly into Lisbon and into Seville. The estimate is the population of Lisbon in 1500, which is about 100,000 people, which makes it one of the 3 or 4 largest cities in Europe, is about 10% black. Right? So what you already have is a 50-year or so experience with African slaves in Spain and Portugal before the expansion across the Americas ever begins. So the slave trade at that point is up the coast of West Africa.
And there's slaves in Portugal?
There's slaves in Portugal and in Spain. So these are people who are legally, juridically enslaved, right? They're owned by Spaniards or Portuguese. So this is before the traffic actually begins across the Americas.
Would these be household slaves?
Most of them are employed in urban settings. It's not what we tend to think of in the Americas where most people are engaged in agricultural labor. So what you're going to get is, the important thing is there's an experience, right, before the explosion of the trade across the Atlantic. So that initial demand is a demand that's very small into those Iberian major cities. What's going to happen, what really touches off the massive transatlantic slave trade, is the rise of sugar plantations in Brazil. In the late 1560s and 1570s, the Portuguese began to plant sugar on the coast of northeastern Brazil, and it works beautifully. Right? The Portuguese have 100 years experience planting cane sugar in the islands of the Atlantic, Madeira, the Azores, the Canaries. Especially in Madeira, right? Once they strip Madeira of all its wood, right, which is where it gets its name, you got to figure out what do you do with this place. So on a very small scale, they start planting cane sugar. It's the Genoese who teach them how to do this. How do you organize this? How do you cultivate it? How do you extract the sugar? They don't have enough labor, so they start bringing black Africans across as slaves into these little islands. So for decades, before Brazil takes off, for over 100 years, the Portuguese have like a laboratory. Right? They're producing cane sugar. They're using African slave labor on a very small scale. This is the prototype. So in the 1560s and 1570s, when they start to plant this cane sugar on the coast of northeastern Brazil, they use the same technology, the same business practices, and they start to bring across African slaves. At first, they don't want to do this. The logical thing to do is to enslave the Indians. But the Indians resist, they die, they fight back, it's not viable. So they give up on this. Here's a Vanderbilt side. The first book about this in English is actually written by Alexander Marchand, who taught at Vanderbilt for 30 years, right, from the late 40s to the late 1970s, called From Barter to Slavery. And he tracks, it's his dissertation, which becomes, it tracks this process of how the Portuguese try and exchange goods, right? We give you axes and bullets and gunpowder. Will you come work for us? And then pretty soon they keep up in the ante. And then finally they say, no, that's not enough. So finally they have to engage in enslaving the Indians. The Indians die, resist, flee. It's unviolent. So what do? You bring in these expensive African slaves, but as you bring more and more of them, it becomes cheaper and more viable. So the transatlantic slave trade really takes off after about 1570 around Brazilian sugar plantations. And so Brazil becomes the first great sugar plantation of the world.
Were any Africans that had lived in Portugal, were they brought to the islands and Brazil to help with the others?
Some come across, Jane will talk, as I'm sure, when she talks to Spanish America. In the conquest of the Americas, there are blacks, both slave and free, who participate in that conquest. I'm sure she'll mention, Juan Garrido is this black who is with Cortez as they march into central Mexico and conquer the Aztecs. And so in these Aztec drawings, there are all these Spanish and this black guy. Right? One of the more famous episodes is Cabeza de Vaca, who wanders across Texas and northern Mexico in the 1520s and 1530s. One of the guys with him is Estebanico, who is a slave, who's been brought across with them. So what's taking place is some of those are coming across, but largely as people who are already part of the conquest infrastructure as opposed to bringing them across as labor. Right? Because the basic pattern is why ship Portuguese and Spanish peasants across the Atlantic, drain your own labor force that you're exploiting, right? To build a new world. No, we need to find an alternative source of labor. So if it's not Indians, it's going to be these Africans.
Did they already have established camps, so to speak, where they got these slaves? And was there like a community they knew?
What begins to take place, if you look on this map at those places that are slightly shaded red in West Africa, this is where the Portuguese and the Spanish begin to establish footholds. They establish trading posts. By the 1480s, the Portuguese have gotten as far as what today is Angola. And at the end of the 1480s, they finally enter the Indian Ocean. The most, as you'll see here in a second, the most important region is what today is roughly Benin, Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon. That sort of arc is where they're going to be. This is where, I actually got a picture here in a second, where they're most set up. So by the time this takes off in the 1560s to 1570s, they have small settlements and outposts that are staging areas for loading people up and taking them across the Atlantic. What the Brazilian sugar explosion does is massively accelerate this process. But the important thing is that they've got decades and decades of small-scale experience with this. What Brazil does is elevate. And so the slave traffic goes like this. Right? And the basic pattern you'll see here in a second on the slave trade is it's going to continue to rise in the global transatlantic slave trade until the 18th century. And then at the end of the 18th century, few people in places like England start going, this is probably immoral. We shouldn't be doing this. Interestingly enough, the Quakers, have you guys seen this movie, The Amazing Grace? Right. Well, I mean, this is sort of looking at this. They suddenly go, wait, should we be doing this? So slowly but surely they get this movement to stop the transatlantic slave trade and then eventually stop slavery itself. But it's really not until the 18th century that anybody in Europe goes, maybe this is not moral. So the pattern is it rises and rises, and then in the late 18th century, what you see in that movie is they say, no, we got to stop this. And so the global pattern is after about 1800, the trade continually declines. It's abolished throughout. What you're seeing in that movie is in the 1830s, in 1807, 1808, it ends in British colonies in British North America, the traffic. It doesn't end in Brazil until 1850. And it doesn't really end in Cuba until about the 1870s. So when people track the flow, they'll say the transatlantic slave trade in the Americas is roughly 1500 to about 1870. We're going to see when we get to Brazil. In Brazil, the curve is like this. It's rising all the way to 1850 at the moment that it's abolished. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Where did this demand for sugar come from? I mean, sugar was there before, obviously, but all of a sudden did somebody come
This is
spark
class.
everybody's interest?
I always say that it's the anybody who's a dentist in here, thank the Portuguese. I mean, there are sweets in Europe, but the major source of sweets is honey. So cane sugar, which actually originates in the East Indies and works its way across the Indian Ocean, then into the Mediterranean by the Middle Ages, is a highly concentrated, specialized, and secretive business. So it's a luxury item. So what happens is what the Brazilians do, this is like color TVs, right, or cell phones, right? You produce more and more of this, and suddenly the price starts to drop as everybody consumes it, right? So sugar, which is a highly expensive item when they first started doing this, by the middle of the 16th century is accessible to everyone. So it's really the Portuguese shipping this out of Brazil that you're creating demand, literally, right? So that kind of, it is true. I mean, just imagine now suddenly everybody's eating real sugar and it's bad for your teeth, right? But you just don't live long enough to have cavities, right? So basically what's happening is they're creating demand. So cane sugar production coming across the Atlantic, really, you're creating demand as you're producing. But what's going to happen is that the Portuguese do this, and by about 1620, the Dutch are going, hey, this is a good business. So the Dutch invade Brazil, right? They occupy the northeastern coast. They figure out how to do this. They leave Brazil and they go into the Caribbean. They then establish sugar plantations in the Caribbean. The British do it, the French do it, and in the 18th century, all the major colonial powers, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch, are all producing sugar in the Caribbean, right? The Brazilians are producing sugar in the Caribbean. And then what happens? Then you get the rise of tobacco and then cotton in the southern U.S. So in the 18th century, the reason there's a huge demand is all the major plantation societies in the Americas are at their peak, right? Slave labor and sugar in Brazil, and gold and coffee, right? In the Caribbean, sugar and tobacco, and in the southern U.S., tobacco and cotton. So in the 18th century, the demand for that slave labor magnifies dramatically. And then post about 1780 is the gradual political suppression of what's going on. Right? There's this old debate about, is slavery capitalistic, is it profitable? I'm telling you, all the people I studied in Brazil who were using slaves, they were making money hand over fist, and it was incredibly profitable right to the very end. I wrote a book about a British gold mine. And in the 19th century, the British are convinced that slavery is an inefficient, backward mode of labor. They want people to be free wage laborers. They don't want to use slaves. This mine owns 1,500 slaves. Right? It's probably the single largest concentration of slaves in Brazil in the 19th century. They constantly complain, we don't like this, it's inefficient, it's backward. They're making money hand over fist. They're paying regular dividends, and I'm always looking at this going like, they may think it's inefficient, but they're doing a pretty profitable business here. But they are convinced it's not an efficient form of labor. So what's going to take place then is as Brazilian sugar takes off, the traffic accelerates. In the 16th century and the 17th century, all the major European powers become involved in this. What you see in this map is this graphic. Where do these guys primarily come from out of Africa? And where are they going to across the Atlantic? Most of the slaves who come across come from this heavily shaded area from roughly what today is Senegal down to Angola. In the late 18th century, the Portuguese will start to ship slaves out of what today is Mozambique. So there is this period of about 40 or 50 years where the Portuguese in particular are shipping slaves out of Mozambique, but that's late in the process. As you're going to see here in a second, that's also a lot farther away, right? And we can see this in the slave records because when they come ashore in many places in the Americas, the way they are registered is what's called their nation, right? And this is an incredible thing, right? Because most people who are making these registries probably know very little about the people they're actually registering. And so they go Mozambique, Congo, Mina, right, Mandinga. So they're putting these things down so we can sort of see roughly where they're coming from. Somebody else had their hand up. Fred.
Are these slaves 100% black?
What does that mean?
No, I mean,
They're sub-Saharan
are they
Africans.
coming from anywhere else is what I'm saying.
They're overwhelmingly come from what we would think of as black Africa today. This is why when you look at that early slave trade in the coast of West Africa, they're bringing these guys out of Morocco and Mauritania and these places where the color of their skin, their ethnicity is incredibly varied, right? But what this trade is largely the regions they're coming from was what we think of today as black Africa.
Well, as you said, in earlier days, there had been white slaves.
Well, this is why I think the interesting thing is that anybody can be enslaved, right? Anywhere. So what you have to construct is your rationale for what makes it possible for you to enslave peoples. When they come across the native peoples in the Americas, they have a debate. The Spanish have a debate. Are these humans? Right. Are they humans? We have to decide. They're nowhere in the Bible. They're not in the ancient Greek and Roman writers. They don't exist in the main authorities of Western civilization. Who are these people? So they have a debate about this. And in the end, they decide, yes, they're humans, because A, they have souls, and they have the faculty of reason. Therefore, they can choose between salvation or not salvation. Right? But they're kind of like children. So they're going to be wards of the state. Right? So they will not be treated the same as Europeans, and they cannot be enslaved except when they engage in war against you, just war theory. Right? So if they resist, they fight back, then you're allowed to enslave them. What happens in the Americas is the number of Indians who are enslaved in that sort of sense, as own chattel, are very rare. The larger picture of Indians in the Americas is forced Indian labor. Have you guys seen the movie The Mission?
Yes.
Yeah, Robert De Niro, the Jesuit. It's like, God, you talking to me? Hey, we got a Jesuit Pope. Oh my God, I can't believe this. That's what Robert De Niro is doing in that movie at the beginning. He's going out, enslaving Indians, bringing them back. And so in that case, you've got all kinds of ethnic groups, indigenous peoples who are being enslaved, but ultimately they decide this is too much trouble, they die off, it doesn't work, we're going to use Africans. So in that sense, there are slaves all over the Americas who are not black, but the vast majority of people who are living in slavery are people of sub-Saharan African origin. Paul?
Was there something about the African culture that made them better slaves?
This is interesting. When you look at those nations, there are perceptions by different Europeans over the qualities of the people they're picking up. Right? These guys are more combative and uncooperative. These guys are more docile. These guys are better at gold mining. These people are better at agriculture. So they have perceptions of that. And sometimes there's a reality to this. If you get people out of West African areas where there is gold mining, there's a chance you get somebody who actually has that knowledge, right? Panning for gold. So there is a perception by the enslavers themselves, especially as time goes by, over which kind of African peoples they would like based on those perceptions.
Were the Africans less susceptible to European diseases than the indigenous Americans?
Well, this is, yes, because this is Africa, Asia, and Europe had trade going on for thousands of years. So anything that has emerged has been passed around. So smallpox has been shared, right? Influenza has been shared. All these things have been passed around so that when they come across the Americas, in the Americas, none of these people have ever been exposed to this. So Europeans and Africans still die from smallpox. They still die from it, but in small numbers, right? They've developed levels of immunity. Indigenous peoples in the Americas have zero immunity. So quite literally, entire villages just die, right? Because you have no immunity. This still exists to some extent. There's certain indigenous peoples in the Amazon who have been isolated enough, even now, right, that when they come into contact with certain outside diseases, they still are much more susceptible to die than you or I am. So in this sense, this is also part of the perception. If we get these guys from Africa, they're resilient, they're tougher, they will survive, it's a better investment. These Indians are weak, lazy, they die off. So there are those perceptions that are there. So what's happening is what you're constructing is a system all across the coast of West Africa to gather slaves, load them onto ships, and send them across the Atlantic. This has actually become a sort of tourist thing now. If you go to Cape Coast Castle in Ghana, or the old Portuguese fortress at Elmina, there's a whole tourism business associated around it. Oh, the door of no return. Most of the people who are shipped out are standing on the beach somewhere. Right? They're not in these castles. What the Portuguese do is they build these castles out on little points, right? So they've only got one unprotected side. The only reason they're able to stay there is because the Africans agree to trade with them. Right? Anytime the Africans wanted, they could overrun these forts and destroy these guys. So what's taking place is the construction of these trading posts, and in particular for the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Danes, virtually everybody, is that coast, the sort of Bight of Benin, right? This sort of area from West Africa down to about Cameroon, this sort of elbow area. So what's taking place is they create these staging grounds. And what they do is they bring across, as we're going to see here, somewhere between 10, depends on who's doing the calculating, 10 to 13 million Africans reach this side of the Atlantic alive. Okay. You probably have to double that number from the point of enslavement. Joe Miller, who's this fabulous African historian at Virginia, wrote this book on the Angolan slave trafficking. And he sort of made a rough calculation that, okay, for every 100 slaves who are captured somewhere in the interior of Africa, about 49 to 50 of those arrive alive on the shores of the Americas. Right? So when you say it's probably 10 to 12, 13 million, it's probably initially about 20 to 25 million people who are enslaved some point somewhere in Africa. But again, the demand for labor in the Americas is what's driving the trade. It's largely demand on these enormous plantations. The trade begins about the 1440s and lasts until about the 1870s. This is the largest forced migration, systematic forced migration in human history. Right? If you count the displacement of the Second World War, tens of millions of people are displaced, but that's displaced by war. Right? This is a sustained, systematic, forced migration of people over more than 3 centuries. And as we're going to see in these sessions, that basically what's taking place here is most of these people, they're going to be everywhere in the Americas. Sub-Saharan African slaves are brought everywhere in the Americas, from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego. Right. But the single largest concentrations are going to be on the coast of Brazil, in the Caribbean Basin, and in what today is the southern U.S. Those are the great concentrations. But you can go anywhere in the Americas before 1850 and find African slaves. Right? They're in the silver mines of Bolivia, they're mining silver in northern Mexico, they're doing everything conceivable, and they're engaged in every conceivable occupation. And everyone is complicit in this. There's this great book by John Thornton called Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World. And he basically says, look, Africans, whatever, I'll talk about that in a second. Africans are enslaving other Africans and selling them to Europeans, and all of the Europeans involved. Muslims, Christians, Jews, you name it. Right? Everybody's involved in this. And the white kids in the class go like, oh, we're off the hook. I go, no, you're not off the hook. We're all in this. It's like, oh, whoa, it's not just us, huh? And it is astonishing. And there is no such thing as Africa, right? Africa is this name that some geographers in Europe have put on a map. What exists is just like the Americas. There are thousands of different kinds of people speaking different languages, of different ethnic backgrounds, of different cultural systems, different levels of technology and politics. And it's a lot like Native Americans, right? Native Americans, usually whatever they call themselves is the people, right? And then there's everybody else, right? This is one of the great ironies of Native American movements in the 20th and 21st century. When the Spanish and the Portuguese show up, they're going, no, I have nothing to do with that guy. I'm nothing like him, right? All the indigenous people see themselves as completely distinct. And today, the effort is to create a Native American movement across all of the Americas. There's something called Native Americans, right? They've actually eventually bought the Spanish and Portuguese version, right? So in this sense, it's not Africans enslaving Africans. It's this group of people in Africa enslaving this other group of people in Africa. So in this sense, what's taking place is an incredibly complex system of warfare, exchange, commerce. And the Europeans, as John Thornton points out, our notion of Europeans overrunning Africa, that's the 19th century, right? Until you get repeating rifles, machine guns, steam engines, and quinine, right? Africa is deadly for Europeans, which is why all those guys are not carving up Africa till the end of the 19th century. Right? So before, especially before, say, 1700, right, the only way the Europeans are able to trade is because these peoples that they encounter on the coast of Africa allow them to. Right? So what's happening is a complex process. Have you guys seen Amistad, Steven Spielberg? Despite the fact that the last part of the movie really bugs me, it's like, let's all wave the flag, how good we are. So, okay, enough of that. What he is showing you in that movie, though, is something which is very standard. Somebody's enslaved in some sort of warfare, they're sold, they change hands several times, and eventually they end up at this place on the coast of Africa where Europeans purchase them and then ship them out. This shipment across the Atlantic is what's often referred to as the Middle Passage, the passage between Africa and the Americas. And one of the things about Spielberg's movie, this is like trying to make a movie on the Holocaust. we can't really, truly show you what it would look like. We wouldn't be able to watch, right? I mean, it is so brutal and inhumane beyond our experience. There's simply no way you can make a movie, certainly a commercial movie, and completely recreate that. And this is what I always say, this is, when I teach this class, this is unimaginable for our experience. We cannot even conceive of how bad this was. These Africans, when they show up on the coast, are put into pens. In the Spanish and Portuguese possessions, they believe they need to baptize these people before they send them across the Atlantic. So there's a baptism, and then they're branded. And then they're placed on small boats, shipped out to the larger boats. Many of these people come from the interior of Africa, have never seen the ocean before. Right? Never seen a ship. Right? They're placed on these ships, and they are quite literally stuffed in there. These are some of the examples of the shackles. Very famous painting from the British abolitionist movement here. And I'd say it's just, they recreate this to some extent in Amistad. People are literally chained up below decks in the tropics, right? Where the on-deck temperature is probably above 100 degrees, right? In the best of cases, they're fed enough and given enough water to survive coming across. Those are the best of cases. And what they also show you in Amistad is sometimes there's problems and you need to get rid of people, you just throw them overboard. Right? So what's going to take place is this massive transportation of millions of people across the Atlantic between about 1500 and about 1870 that is constantly accelerating in scale up until the late 18th century. This drawing here is very famous from the British abolitionist movement showing the stacking. They literally construct slave ships. The sort of standard size is about 400 people. And they literally have people in these sort of bunks, side by side, chained together below deck. One of the things you see in that movie, Amazing Grace, is he arranges for them to sort of slide by in their boat by a slave ship. And the stench of the ship is so overwhelming, it really unnerves the people he's brought along to show, right, to impress upon them. Some of these slave ships were such bad shape, once they got across, they just burn them and sink them. Now think of how profitable a business must be, that you can ship people all the way across the Atlantic, lose maybe 20% in the passage, and then destroy the ship and still make money. That's an incredibly profitable business, which is why everybody's engaged in this. There are all kinds of debates about numbers here. Paul?
Were they mainly males?
Overwhelmingly males, overwhelmingly above the age of 12 or 13. There's a database I'm going to show you here in a second. One of the great things that's happened over the last 10 years or so is a process through an electronic database to systematically gather all the records we know of and put them in the same database on every ship, everything we know about every ship. The ship manifest, if you have it, how many people, destinations. And so what they've been constructing now is it's up to about 30,000 voyages. Right? And it's largely, as Jane will say, it's largely skewed towards the British Atlantic. Right? Most of the trade in Spanish and Portuguese territories is still not in there yet. But the standard view of this is that most are males, which probably means above about the age of 12. But what they're finding in a lot of these databases now, increasing their larger than anticipated numbers of children and women on board the ships. But the usual bias is that they wanted people for hard agricultural labor, therefore they're looking for males. But my guess is once this database is fully constructed, they're going to start to see patterns there in male-female ratios and age that they hadn't suspected before. These are sort of rounded estimates. There's actually a plaque on the state capitol grounds which has 100 million on it. It's like they didn't consult the historian when they put that plaque up, I'm sure. Best estimates is somewhere between 10, 12, 13, 14 million people. The numbers are getting more towards 12 or 13 million with this database as you start to say, here we actually have all the records we know of, let's get a better sense of this. But this shows you the kind of process. In the 16th century, about 750,000 slaves come across the Atlantic. This is just as Brazil started to take off. In the 17th century, that has tripled, right, because now the Caribbean's starting to come into play. In the 18th century, the number nearly triples again. Right? So most of the slaves that come across the Atlantic come across in the 18th century, most of those on British ships. Right? And it's then the British who decided to stop doing this. In the 19th century, it only goes, most of the traffic is over by 1850 when the Brazilians abolished the slave traffic into Brazil. But there are still people coming in the 1860s and 1850s, 1860s. So you're really looking at about a half a century there. So they still brought, if you'd have doubled that number, right, it'd be about 5 million people had it gone on throughout the 19th century. So it's probably somewhere around 12 or 13 million people. And again, you have to figure that the mortality rate getting there was probably about 50%. Okay, so this trip is from Africa to the Americas, largely from Western Africa. The typical voyage from West Africa to a place like Brazil or the Caribbean is 3 to 4 weeks. Assuming everything works okay, no storms, you got wind. From Mozambique to Brazil, it was 8 to 10 weeks, which meant you were more likely to have a problem with higher mortality rates, accidents. One of the interesting things is that the mortality rates of the crew is basically the same as it is for the shipment of slaves. It's a deadly business to be on the crew of a slave ship, right? This is why the great song, my all-time favorite song, Amazing Grace, right? John Newton is a slave ship captain, right? Who comes back and has this experience, a religious experience, and eventually writes Amazing Grace. So it's an incredibly dangerous thing to be on, whether you're the crew or the slaves being shipped. But here, I'll show you let's see if this works. I did. So there is a slave database. Jane Landers and her students have been working on this. This started about 10, 15 years ago. As technology changes, it's gotten more and more sophisticated and a little bit more user-friendly. When we first started doing this, I tried to have my students use it. Like, oh, God, give up. It's too complicated. So they're getting better at that, but this is what they're going to do is eventually every single piece of paper that we have about every single voyage, all the information will be in this one database so that you could simply say, how many people came from Ghana in 1500 to 1550? Click, and it'll show this. You can say, how many British ships sailed out of Liverpool in 1750? Click, and it'll pop up. All right, so it's an incredible thing, which means we're moving a lot closer to harder data. Now, part of the discussion of this, there's this very famous book by Orlando Patterson, who's a Jamaican sociologist who teaches at Vanderbilt to the north up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That was incredibly influential, came out in the 1980s, called Slavery is Social Death. It had enormous influence for a long time, where he basically says, what, the whole purpose of this was to basically eradicate the slaves, the whole genealogy, culture, existence, personality, to create social death, right? It wasn't simply to enslave them and use their labor, it literally was to eradicate. This was an enormous influence for a long time. Most people who study slavery now say, this is baloney, right? If you look at the Americas today, what survives is testimony to what they kept, right? To the things they kept in their head, the culture they held on to, all those values, the things they loved, the things they tried to reconstruct once they got to this side of the America. So the emphasis now tends to be on what was it that people hung on to, right? What did they keep? And what Jane, no doubt, will talk about, since this is her specialty, is what's called creolization, which is a controversy. She gets a lot of flack about this because people use this term in different ways. But the emphasis is on the plasticity of people, right? The people that she's going to talk about, one of the great things about her work is she has real individuals that she's reconstructed their lives. So it's not just talking about numbers or stereotypes or generics, right? She's talking about real people that she's managed to construct their lives. And they really are transatlantic people. Right, people who start out in Africa, work in the Caribbean, end up fighting the American Revolution, then the Haitian Revolution, then ended up in Spanish Florida. She's reconstructed their lives, and what you see is these people are incredibly plastic. They will hang on to their African languages. They will hang on to some of their African traditions. They will become Catholics and then Protestants, learn Spanish and then English and then French, right? So what they construct their lives, which are incredible, what we would think of as multicultural and multilingual today. That doesn't mean they've given up everything they were. It means they keep adding on other things. And so the emphasis in slave studies now tends to be on how plastic these people are, and in particular what they hang on to from the old world. So these slaves end up in basically three main places, the most important which, this is true, is Brazil. Right, the mantra. I did a Vanderbilt alumni tour, I don't know, about 15 years ago. We went to Costa Rica and Panama, and I love Costa Rica. I went to school there when I was an undergraduate. And at the end of the trip, everyone goes, we love Costa Rica, but Brazil is the most important country in Latin America. Brazil is this place, we'll talk more about in a couple of weeks, where the Portuguese have a 2,000-mile long coastline, which they do not control. Right? So throughout about from about 1500 to about 1650, the Portuguese are contending with the Dutch and the French in particular for that coastline. So what the Portuguese want to do is construct a permanent presence. So the way to do this is to set up established cities. So the turning point in terms of slavery in Brazil is in 1549. They construct a colonial capital on the northeastern coast of Brazil at Salvador, Thavia, right? Which is often Bahia de Todos os Santos do Salvador, the Bay of All Saints of Our Savior, right? So it's often called Bahia, right, which is the bay, or Salvador, either one of those. And what they do is they say, okay, we have to have something that will produce a revenue so that we can tax and we can generate a colony that's functional. So they start planting cane sugar. Right? So the takeoff point in Brazil is about 1550, planting sugar. It turns out it's a great place to plant sugar. Still is. A great place to plant sugar. And then they can't satisfy the demand for labor with the Indians, so then they start to bring Africans across the Atlantic. So the Portuguese construct the first major slave society in the Americas on the northeastern coast of Brazil, and it's almost entirely coastal. Right? All these Brazilian settlements until 1700 are going to be right on the coast. Right? So Salvador, northeastern coast, is the starting point. So 1570, this takes off, and by 1600, Brazil is producing most of the sugar consumed in Europe. Right. The other major region is the Caribbean. If you look at the total picture of all the slaves that come across in those ships in those roughly 350 years, somewhere between 35 and 40% of those end up in what today is Brazil. So the political entity, if you can call it that, right? Brazil is sort of this coastline. But what today is Brazil is the largest single recipient of African slaves by far. Right? Which is why today Brazil has the largest population of African descent outside of Africa. Right? Although when we get to Brazil, I'll talk a little more about that. Depends on what you mean by Africans. Right? So Brazil is the biggest. The next biggest is the Caribbean, but the Caribbean is fragmented. Right? Because the Caribbean is all these... it's a Spanish lake until about 1650. Right? Right, so the Spanish come in, they gain control of the islands of the Caribbean. They have this sort of monopoly. It's the gateway in and out of the empire. Right? All those Spanish ships coming in to Mexico, all those silver fleets going out, have to pass through the Caribbean, which is why the Straits of Florida are so important. Right? And the Spanish construct this galleon system, right? Because the British and the French and the Dutch are always after them. Heavily fortified fleets that regularly cross back and forth across the Atlantic. And when they cross, going back, they have the entire silver production of Bolivia and Mexico in the same fleet. Right? In the 1620s, a Dutch fleet captures this, lock, stock, and barrel. Right? Big year for the Dutch West India Company. Right. I always say this is like, imagine the United States government collects all of its taxes for a year, puts them in an armored car, and as it heads from New York to Washington, somebody takes it. Right. So this is basically what happens in the 1620s. So the Caribbean is vital as the shipping lanes. By 1600, the Dutch Republic has emerged. The Dutch will become the great naval power on the planet in the first half of the 17th century. And by about 1650, the British have emerged as their challengers. So the 17th century is the story of a global war between the Dutch and the British on all oceans, that eventually the English win. Right? This is bad news for the Spanish. All right. So in the 1600s, right, the Dutch, the French, and the British start to come into the Caribbean and seize territory. Right? It's Pirates of the Caribbean. All right? This is it. This is where you get it. Right? Initially, these guys who were like mercenaries, and eventually, oh no, he's ours. Francis Drake, yes, he's one of ours. Okay, he's a good guy. Right? So what you start to see, so all that stuff about Pirates of the Caribbean, that's the 17th century. Right? So the French will grab control of the west end of Hispaniola, which today is Haiti. Right? They'll grab other territories in the islands of the Caribbean. The British will come in. They will seize Jamaica in the 1650s. So what you see when you look at the Caribbean today is the legacy of the 17th century. Right? That polyglot, English, Dutch, French, Spanish-speaking Caribbean, that's from the 17th century. And so after about 1650 then, what you've got is all of these European powers, everybody, even if they only got a tiny little place like Aruba and Curacao. Right? All of them are there. And so after about 1650 then, you start to see sugar, tobacco, dyes being produced in the islands of the Caribbean and shipped across the Atlantic. We'll talk about this more when we get to Saint-Domingue. The richest place, the richest colony in the world in 1750 is what today is Haiti. Right? Most of what France is making in money is coming out of trade with what's called Saint-Domingue. Right? So these are incredibly lucrative, productive operations. When the Haitian revolt breaks out in the 1790s, there are about 450,000 people in what today is Haiti. 400,000 of those are slaves. And most of those 400,000 were born in Africa, right, and have made the trip across, right. So this is an enormous diaspora of African peoples all across the Caribbean basin. So this is why when you go to the Caribbean today, right, and you see it ethnically, this is the legacy of the 17th century, right, of all these imperial powers. And so what you will see there then is it's about another 35–40% of the total, but it's dispersed among lots of different political entities. So Brazil, Caribbean, those two zones are most of the slaves who come to the Americas by far, those two zones. The smallest of the major plantation slave societies in the Americas is here. Smallest. Okay. British North America, it takes off late. I'd love to say this. It's like Jamestown, God, 1609. It's like the Spanish have been in Mexico City for 100 years. Right? Mexico City is the largest city in the Americas well into the 19th century. Right? So British North America takes off late, and you get this sort of split, right? Those northern colonies, I'm a southerner. Those northern colonies, right? You can't grow anything in Vermont. You go up there, it's like, oh, it's really wonderful to hike in the summer. Oh, you come ski in the winter. Oh, have some maple syrup. There's nothing there, right? But in the southern, geography doesn't matter. In the southern colonies, right? Even Maryland, right? Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, you start to plant crops. You start to bring in African slave labor. So what emerges in what's the old South, right, looks very much like the Caribbean and Brazil, right? So Charleston, New Orleans start to look a lot like Salvador and Havana, right? So the southern colonies developed a slave plantation society, right? As we're going to see when we see the individual cases, each of these places, British North America looks very different from Brazil and looks very different from Spanish places. So what's going to take place then is British North America comes on late, right? It's really in the 18th century that this takes off, and this is where timing is really different. The number of slaves who come into the Americas and end up in what today is the U.S. is about 7 or 8% of the total traffic. 7 or 8%. I love to say this to our African American and Diaspora Studies program, okay? You guys keep talking about African Americans. Well, most African Americans live outside of the U.S., right, by far. So the U.S. comes on late, and what's striking about the U.S. slave system is in 1800, there are about 800,000 or 900,000 slaves in the southern U.S. Right? The slave traffic in the United States is shut off when? When's slave trade abolished? It's in the Constitution. January 1st, 1808. When they construct the Constitution, they put in a clause there. It says, they're warning the Southern planters, right? All right, you're in this, but come January 1st, 1808, traffic stops. So legally, the traffic stops coming to the United States in 1808. Right? There's still illegal shipments, but it's on a small scale. Right? So when that traffic stops, there are less than 1 million slaves in the United States. And how many slaves did Lincoln free? 4 million. Right? It is the only slave society in the Americas that reproduces, and it reproduces dramatically. So when Jane talks about British North America, in that moment, from about 1800 to 1860, when you no longer have access to a new trade, you have to do something with your slaves to make sure that they're reproducing, or your slave system is gone. Right? That society goes from 1 million to 4 million slaves over about a half a century. Right? Brazil, slavery never increases by natural reproduction. Never.
Why not?
Why not?
Why did the slavery in Brazil and other parts of south of the United States did slavery not?
This is a long argument that goes back about 70 years now. Jane may talk about this, but there's a famous book called Slave and Citizen in the Americas by Frank Tannenbaum, who was a sociologist at Columbia University. Tiny little book, where in the late 40s he says, look, if you look at this, in Latin America, slaves had legal personage. The Catholic Church theologically recognized their salvation. They are treated better than in Protestant North America. So he basically says slavery must have been less harsh in Latin America than the United States. And it touches off an ongoing debate for decades that people keep responding to. Carl Degler, who's a U.S. historian who learns to read Spanish and Portuguese, writes this book that wins every conceivable historical prize in the early 1970s called Neither Black Nor White. And he compares the U.S. and Brazil. And he goes exactly, he says, now wait a minute. If you look at reproduction in the United States and you look at what happens in Brazil, things must have been pretty bad in Brazil. Right? He says, I can't prove this to you, but in this old debate about which system is harsher, the Brazilian slaves don't last long. The attitude is, 4 or 5 years, you got your investment back, get another one. So one of the material conditions of life clearly are different in a place like Brazil. And as you look across the Caribbean, you can see this for areas we have better records for. What were mortality rates? Did people survive? Did they reproduce? And this is clearly what happens in the United States is slave planters know their system cannot survive unless they have at least enough conditions for people to reproduce and survive. Bob?
Is there any significant difference in the escape rates in Brazil, which is such a big open place, when you compare it, say, to the Caribbean and other locations?
The short answer is yes. Jane will probably talk about this more since this is her specialty. I'm not a historian of slavery. I'm a historian of one of the largest slave societies in the Americas. What's always been striking to me is how few runaway slave communities and how few rebellions there are in the United States. I mean, you can count slave rebellions on one hand. And some of those were not rebellions. They stopped them before they started. If you look at the West Indies and Brazil, it's constant. Runaway slave communities, maroon communities, quilombos. I mean, maybe this is geography, I don't know, but what's striking about the United States is in that period of its peak, say roughly 1750 to about 1760 to 1860, is how much more controlled the society is. And this must be something about control. You create a repressive enough system, right, that the incentives to try and flee are so much higher that you don't do it or you rebel less often. Whereas in a place like Brazil, there's constant, there are runaway slave communities everywhere. Everywhere. Jamaica's famous for having these enormous runaway slave communities. So it's striking. But this also gets back to Tannenbaum. Part of what Tannenbaum says is legally there is a mechanism in Spanish and Portuguese law for emancipation. You can buy your freedom. You can achieve emancipation. This is one of the things where Jane, after people have criticized Tannenbaum for long, will come back and say, no, Tannenbaum does have something he's saying here is right. If I were a slave, legally and theologically, it's probably better to be under the Spanish than Portuguese. And this is why she studies Spanish. She'll probably talk about this. She studies Spanish Florida, right? Here are all these blacks, they achieve their freedom, they're living, they have houses, they have property, they have families. Then the British come in. It's like, no, we're not going to let you do that. Then the Spanish come back. It's like, oh, okay. Then the Americans come in. It gets even worse. So the legal regime you're under matters. And it is true that in especially a place like Brazil, besides escape, the options for emancipation, there's a possibility there that doesn't exist by the 19th century in the United States. Part of what happens in the United States in the 19th century is after the Haitian Revolt, a lot of those planters literally come to places like South Carolina and they go, you don't want this here. The slave system becomes more rigid, more repressive, more controlled in the U.S. after 1800. The racial system in the United States, right, the fluidity of the racial system in the United States closes down. So in effect, it's increasingly difficult to be anything but black or white. And if you're black, you're a slave. The percentage of blacks who are free in the South in 1860 is 2%, which means that black and slave is synonymous. Right? What they construct in the first half of the 1960s is an increasingly rigid legal regime, making it harder and harder. You can't even free your slaves many times if you want to. Right? So they make it more and more difficult to do that. Whereas in a place like Brazil or Cuba, especially Brazil, the options are there. It's limited, but the possibility is there. So Tannenbaum's right that legally, but in terms of, if you just look at material conditions of life, the Portuguese attitude is like, get 4 or 5 years out of them and we're fine. Okay? So British North America, point here is that it's, in the larger picture of things, the slave trade is a tiny percentage compared to the Caribbean and Brazil. It's late starting, but from about 1810 to 1865, it is the largest slave society in the Americas. Right? It reaches 4 million. This is the point at which the Brazilian population is declining. Right? Brazil, the number of slaves in Brazil after 1850, the slave traffic stopped in Brazil in 1850. No new slaves come in. So what you're seeing from 1850 until Brazil abolishes slavery, the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery is Brazil in 1888. So over those 4 decades, the population of slaves is declining because they're dying or they're achieving their emancipation. So when slavery ends in Brazil in 1888, there are about 700,000 people still in slavery. At the beginning of the century, there were 1.5 million. Question?
Were you saying that no more slave ships came to American soil after 1808?
Not legally. This is what the Amistad case is, right? In the Amistad case, basically, here the ship shows up in Connecticut. What do we do with these guys? Right? It's illegal. They've been obtained. So there's this huge court case, right, that says, can we in fact give them back to the guys that say they own them? Do we let them stay here? Can they be enslaved? So it goes all the way to the Supreme Court over what do you do with this illegal shipment of slaves. Paul Jova.
What happened to the Brazilian economy as a slave trade?
They bring in Europeans. Is basically what happens. As the planters start to see by the 1860s, 1870s that slavery's, I mean, they really think the days are numbered in the sense that it's going to be the 1920s or something before it happens, right? The Brazilians take a very conservative approach to abolishing slavery, and then they're forced to move into dramatic. They abolish the trade in 1850, so you can't get new people coming in. Then in the early 1870s, they say any child born to a slave will become free at the age of 21. All right. So if you were a woman in childbearing years in 1870, right, you might give birth to a child in, say, 1900, and that child would not be free until 1921. Right? So that's a very conservative way, so let's let it sort of slowly end. In 1887, 1888, slaves start to leave the plantation in huge numbers. They vote with their feet. And the crisis gets bigger and bigger, and they basically turn to the army and say, stop this. The army says, we're not slave hunters. So the Brazilian parliament essentially has 2 choices. Either they face anarchy, or they abolish slavery. So they get together and go, oh, this is not a good idea, let's abolish slavery. They issue a decree and slavery's over. So they present it as sort of this is this magnanimous gesture. The fact is the society's collapsing around them. They've lost control. And it's the slaves themselves who have forced the issue. So what's happening as this takes place is the planters, they're moving toward, this is where Brazil becomes a coffee economy. Right? My wife is a huge coffee drinker. Brazilian coffee, shouldn't say this, but Brazilian coffee is not good coffee. Unless you really like really strong espresso. Brazilian coffee is still like 40% of the world's production, still the world's largest coffee producer. But it tends to be mixed with other things. Right? My wife loves Costa Rican coffee. So whenever I want to keep her happy, I order more Costa Rican coffee. So that coffee production, you guys take for granted now that coffee is easily there. That's a legacy of the early 19th century. Coffee is probably out of the Horn of Africa or the Arabian Peninsula originally. It's transplanted into South America late 18th century, and it starts to be exported from Costa Rica and from Brazil in the 1820s. So by 1840, coffee has become Brazil's largest export. And in the 19th century, it's coffee exports and the taxes on those exports that generate the revenue for the Brazilian government. Brazil never runs a deficit in the 19th century because it has this coffee is continually expanding its exports. They're creating more demand. Right? Don't drink that tea! Drink coffee! So as they see this, now they need not slaves or workers for the sugar plantations in the Northeast. The coffee is initially around Rio and then around Sao Paulo. So now they need workers for the southeast of Brazil. So they go, what they really want is those really white Europeans, Germans. They always want the Germans, right? If they won't come, so it's okay, we'll take the Italians and the Spanish. Right, so there's a massive wave of Italians and Spaniards. As all those guys show up in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, some of them come down to Sao Paulo, Montevideo, and especially to Buenos Aires. Look at the Pope. Right? Yeah, Che! I mean, basically Argentina is resettled by Spaniards and Italians in the late 19th century. And so what replaces slave labor is largely Italian and Spanish labor coming in between about 1880 and 1920. Same phase in the United States when that wave comes across.
Then I assume coffee is not the same kind of crop as you actually use.
No, that's what they're using slaves. Yeah, this is, again, part of my argument. Slavery can be profitable. You can make money off coffee, sugar, gold mining, you name it. Yeah.
But a lot of these people that came in after the slaves, the white Europeans, they came in to do servitude. Now, they weren't slaves, they didn't
Yeah.
the labor, they didn't get a job, they did servitude.
Yeah, well, typically what happens is you sign some labor contract, right, in a place like Barcelona, right, or Seville, or Naples, right, and you come across. The hard thing they have is channeling these guys to the right places. Make sure your guys with your labor agent show up in Sao Paulo and show up in your plantation. So what Sao Paulo constructs is this enormous infrastructure. It's kind of like Ellis Island, right? A receiving place, a processing house, the hostels where you stay, and then you go to the plantation. Here's a little sidelight. After 1908, it's the Japanese. But the Japanese, as in my unsophisticated world, finally learned it was Okinawans primarily. All right. So these guys come in between 1908 and 1940. The largest single population of Japanese descent outside Japan is in Brazil, largely around Sao Paulo. They come in, they come to the coffee plantations, they have all these contracts. First chance they get, they're in the city. They do not stay on the... So what people do is they as quickly as possible, do whatever their labor is and leave the plantation, move to the city.
But they even had it in Puerto Rico, because in Puerto Rico they settled after Napoleon left. They had this little city called Corsica. That's where I have a house.
Yeah.
They're all French, because my family's French.
Yeah.
So they came in to do servitude.
Yeah. Somebody else had a... Mary Pat.
I didn't. Actually, I have a question about the other end of it, the recruitment end in Africa along the coast, and the Africans who were complicit. I have a couple of questions. One is, whom did they capture? Were rival ethnic groups or tribes, or were they just people in their own communities that they?
All of the above.
All the above?
So I mean, this is why I say this is why it's so complex. It's not as though there's a single kind of system and group doing this. So that, I mean, sometimes people are in debt servitude, right? Sometimes people are captured in warfare. Some people just kidnapped. Sometimes it's rivalries. But typically the process is somewhere in the interior, you capture somebody and then you sell them. So people pass through intermediaries before they ever show up on the coast. So the survivors who reach someplace like Elmina, right, have probably passed through several hands before they get there. One of the most Jane will probably talk about this in Bruce. One of the most famous examples, Olaudah Equiano, who was in the Amazing Grace movie, right? Gustavo Vasa. There's this huge ongoing debate of, he comes from a region in West Africa, he talks about being captured. There's this huge debate because this guy at the University of Maryland says he's found documents that the guy was actually born in South Carolina, right? So there's this whole debate of it, but the story he tells in his narrative, which is the most famous of all these slave narratives, is about basically this rivalry. He's captured, he's sold off. So they come in all different forms and fashion. That's why, again, these are rivalries, wars, debts, commerce among lots of different kinds of people in many, many different places. The end result is they're being funneled into the coast. But this is where demand comes back in, right? What feeds this is they know there's a system where they can sell people and make a profit. That doesn't exist before, say, 1450.
And how are they paid? Are they paid in cash? Or?
I don't think there is such a thing as cash. Maybe on the coast there's gold or something. Question?
Yes. Why weren't slaves taken to Argentina in the same numbers that they were taken to Brazil?
Nothing to do with them. I mean, this gets back to demand. When the traffic takes off and thrives, it's in those places where there's a high demand for labor. What today is, I love this as a Brazilian sentence, what today is Argentina at that point is just frontier backward, no people. It's the Great Plains of the United States, right? So Argentina's great boom doesn't take place until about 1870, right? It's the revolution that takes place in the Midwest. I used to live in Kansas. Wheat, right? Cattle. And so Argentina, between about 1870 and 1930, becomes one of the richest countries in the world. And it basically becomes this huge, the Pampas becomes this enormous factory of wheat and beef. By that point, slavery is ending. So had that happened 100 years earlier, they probably would have brought in slaves into Argentina. You do see, this gets back to my point, slaves are, black people are everywhere. You just see slaves in all these sort of places, even when there's just say cattle ranching culture, small groups of people. So there are gauchos who are black, right? There are gauchos in Uruguay who are black, right? Who are either slaves or descendants of slaves who've ended up in tiny, tiny numbers compared to a place like the Caribbean or Brazil. All right, so I think our time is up.